Preparing to stream the webinar. All right, and we're live. Hey, Facebook. Okay. Okay, let me make sure we're recording in here. All right, welcome everybody. It's good to see you all. We have over 50 attendants and counting, so that's really exciting to see. Welcome to the second session of Decolonizing Sustainability, Amplifying Indigenous Perspectives and Transforming Sustainability Discourse. This second session, as part of our speaker series, works to highlight and unpack the intersections of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and systems of power, privilege, and oppression within the discourse and rhetoric of contemporary sustainability, environmental, and climate change movements. This series is intended to serve as a deep dive into the problematic and harmful discourses of sustainability with the goal of moving towards a decolonial sustainability movement that amplifies Indigenous sovereignty and experience. As many folks here in the audience know, Humboldt State University is at a very critical moment as we transition into a polytechnic institute, and one that highlights the necessity of Indigenous knowledge and stewardship. Part of this work necessitates understanding and deconstructing how white supremacy and settler colonialism have historically informed sustainability discourse and continue to do so. Today's session is titled, "Nobody Asked You, John Muir, Settler Colonial Environmentalism, White Supremacy and Sustainability." I wish I could take credit for this excellent panel title, but Dr. Katja Risling-Baldi came up with it, and it's easily my favorite panel title ever. We are joined today by two amazing panelists, Dr. Sarah Ray and Dr. Heather Ponchetti Daly. I'll say a few words about each of you, but I encourage you both to share more about yourselves before you present. Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray has been the program leader of the Environmental Studies program at HSU since 2013. She received her PhD in Environmental Sciences, Studies, and Policy with a focal department of English at the University of Oregon. Her first book, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, explores the ways that environmental discourse often reinforces existing social hierarchies, drawing on a legacy of nativist, racial, and ableist exclusion in environmental history. And one lucky person in our audience today will win a free copy of this book. And if you ask nicely, I bet she'll sign it for you. Dr. Ray has also edited 3 additional collections, and her second book, A Field Guide to Climate Change, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, is an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Dr. Heather Ponchetti Daly is a tribal member of the Ipe Nation of Santa Isabel and an adjunct professor in the Department of Environmental and Indigenous Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Daly received her PhD in history from UCLA. She teaches courses in environmental law, federal Indian policy, Indigenous approaches to climate change, and Native American studies and history. Dr. Daly is involved with the UCI History Project, which provides an institutional framework to history teachers, K through 12, to include Native American voices in California. She has worked with Climate Champions, a project to get more teaching, learning, and action on climate change in local schools. And lastly, Dr. Daly has just been appointed to the UC NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, Implementation and Oversight Committee for the California Native American Heritage Commission, representing UCLA. Congratulations on that appointment. That is really, really cool to hear. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get to the exciting part of our panel. At the bottom of your screen, you should all see a Q&A button that you can click on. If you have any questions for our panelists today, please use the Q&A feature. I'll keep track of all the questions there, and we will have time for a discussion towards the end of our session. If you're watching on Facebook, feel free to put a question in the comments. I'll be keeping track of those too, so you're still welcome to participate in the discussion. Recordings of this session will be available. The recording will be immediately available on the HSU NAS Facebook page, and we'll be posting the recording to our YouTube channel a little bit later as well. Those links will be available in the chat for you soon. And at the end of our session, as I already mentioned, one lucky audience member will win a free copy of Sarah Ray's The Ecological Other. Please make sure you stay tuned all the way to the end of the session. We'll be giving the book away around 1:13, 1:14 this afternoon. All right, I have a couple introductory remarks that I would like to make before we dive into the presentations. And so I'm going to go ahead and screen share. So as you can see here, the title of our panel, Nobody Asked You, John Muir. We'll begin this afternoon with a land acknowledgement. Humboldt State University occupies the unceded land of the Wiyot peoples. This includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Gudini means over in the woods or among the redwoods, and was renamed Arcata by settlers in 1860. I always notice that whenever people always put Indigenous place names in italics. So I'm gonna start doing the other way around and put settler place names in italics. Despite this, Wiyot peoples maintain connections to their territory through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. Wiyot peoples are central to the history and future of this place. I'm sure many of you have heard land acknowledgements recited by various institutions and various gatherings. The point I would like to make about land acknowledgements is that they are a first step. And if they don't come with action, they are meaningless and merely performative. All right, if folks would like to learn more about land acknowledgements, I strongly recommend you check out a lecture by Dr. Kutcha Risling-Baldy, available on the HSU NAS YouTube channel. Her lecture is called What Good is a Land Acknowledgement? And she does a deep dive into the politics and performativity of land acknowledgements. And so I know our audience members are likely joining us from many places across Turtle Island and beyond today. If folks could put the ancestral territory in which they are joining us from into the chat, that would be lovely. You can find out that information by going to the website available to you in the chat, or you can text your zip code to this cell phone number that Katie has made available, and you can let us know where you're tuning in from. I have a couple action items for folks today. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. Hold on. There we go. The first thing you can do is, I know there's a lot of students here and I didn't have a lot of money when I was a college student, so I have some free action items for everybody. First thing you can do is go follow the Wiyot tribe on Facebook. If you're joining us from a different region, please go follow whatever tribe whose ancestral territory you are currently on. Stay updated. They post a lot of important stuff. Then you can go follow the NAS department on our Facebook page, our Instagram, and our YouTube channel. You can help me fulfill my dream of being a famous YouTuber. For all the faculty and staff in the audience, I have two action items that you hopefully can participate in. You can pay the Wiyot honor tax at www.honortax.org. You can also donate to the Rue Delaguerre Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace at the link below. You can find all of these links in the chat. Next, I want to spend a few minutes discussing the recommended reading that we posted as part of this event. My computer keeps going a little bit wonky there. And so we recommended that folks read this article by Michael Brune entitled Pulling Down Our Monuments. Last July, the executive director of the Sierra Club, which is the largest environmental organization in the United States, published this article, Pulling Down Our Monuments, wherein he openly discussed the role of early environmental movements in perpetuating settler colonial and white supremacist ideologies about land and Native peoples. Brune names John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, and his role in the removal of Native American people to create national parks and wilderness preserves, specifically the violent removal of Miwok peoples to create Yosemite National Park. Brune writes in his article, the whiteness and privilege of our early membership fed into a very dangerous idea. It's the idea that exploring, enjoying, and protecting the outdoors can be separated from human affairs. Such willful ignorance is what allows some people to shut their eyes to the reality that wild places we love are also the ancestral homelands of Native peoples, forced off their lands in the decades or centuries before they became national parks. It allows them to overlook, too, the fact that only people insulated from systemic racism and brutality can afford to focus solely on preserving wilderness. Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color continue to endure the traumatic burden of fighting for their right to a healthy environment while simultaneously fighting for freedom from discrimination and police violence. I pulled a few more articles that I thought folks would be interested in checking out. This article by Lawrence Hogue, published in 2016 as part of the Tending the Wild series, is titled "What John Muir Missed: The Uniqueness of California Indians." Right. In the in Muir's book, My First Summer in the Sierra, he talks about seeing a bunch of Native women harvesting. He writes, "I came to a patch of elmus or wild rye growing in magnificent waving clumps 6 or 8 feet high, bearing heads 6 to 8 inches long. So far, a classic description of California's fecundity, painted in Muir's usual purple prose. But there are people in this scene too, and Muir doesn't quite know how to treat them. These women he saw, probably Mono Lake Paiutes, were not passively gathering nature's wild bounty. Instead, they were harvesting a carefully tended field, none of which might have existed without centuries of human care." And so the idea of wilderness, right, this pristine, virgin, untouched place, is a socially constructed idea. Right? Many native peoples in California did not have a word for wilderness within their language, and wilderness came to mean lands that were uncared for and untended by early preservation and conservationists. And so we can understand, right, the construction of wilderness as part of the settler colonial ideology that works to mark this place as empty, that works to mark this place as untended and unclaimed. And in so doing, it erases the complex systems of knowledge and ecological management that Indigenous peoples had developed over millennia. Right? One thing I always tell people is California Indians were lighting California on fire way before it was a discovery by ecologists. Right? In fact, Indigenous ecological management practices have been historically criminalized by the state. Right? Ron Reed, a Karuk scholar and cultural practitioner, talks about how to be a good Karuk person, you have to break the law, right? Because the United States and the state of California have worked to criminalize the ecological management regimes, which feed into this idea that this place is an empty, vast, untouched wilderness. One more article I'll flag very briefly. Yosemite finally reckons with its discriminatory past, published in 2018 by Jake Bullinger. He writes, "The first white settlers to enter Yosemite Valley were led in 1851 by a gold rush merchant named James Savage. During a conflict between Native Americans and miners, Savage's trading post was attacked, and he led a group of men into the valley for revenge, hanging some members of the Wanichi tribe, one of 4 native groups in the Miwok family, and shooting a chief's son in the back. After Savage's attack, most of the Awanichi ended up on a reservation in the San Joaquin Valley, although a small band remained in Yosemite. It was into this vacuum that famed naturalist John Muir emerged. He too had little care for the indigenous population. While waxing poetic about the valley's ecology and geology, Muir found its residents, quote, most ugly and some of them altogether hideous. Muir's people-free preservation ideal eventually became national park policy. And as America's greatest idea caught on, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs would together separate Native Americans from landscapes they cherished. As 19th century Oglala Sioux luminary Black Elk noted, the agencies made little islands for us and other little islands for the animals, with the simultaneous establishment of reservations and national parks. Critical Indigenous studies scholars have long critiqued this idea of people-free preservation. Scholars Dan Wildcat and Raymond Pierotti argue that the conservation or preservation paradigm and natural resource extraction are 2 sides to the same Eurocentric or colonial coin. Both viewpoints work to separate human beings from nature as people's able to control, right, and dominate nature rather than being part of that system. I'll close up my remarks here shortly. One of my favorite parts about Brune's article is that he includes the many, many comments that he received, many of which thank him for this accurate portrayal of the early environmental movement and the way that feeds into contemporary sustainability discourse. But there were also many folks that disapproved of what Brune had to say about John Muir and the roots of preservation and conservation in the United States. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just read a couple. Parsing John Muir's life in order to highlight a few moments or beliefs that were not representative of his life's work is absurd. I will find another organization to support. Muir was not a racist, and indeed, in the context of his time, he was tolerant and generous, worthy of respect both then and now. Criticizing Muir is uncalled for. I've been a member of the Sierra Club since the 90s, but I will not renew my membership this year, not because I'm a racist, but because denouncing the wrong ideologies of the past by smearing a great individual via guilt by association is illogical and wrong. Those are just a small sampling, and I'd like to kind of articulate what I see playing out in this comment section. I wish I could take credit for this, but Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy has referred to what she calls the settler colonial stages of grief, right? I assume we're all familiar with the 5 stages of grief: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. And reckoning with the reality of settler colonialism and the genocidal origins of the United States, right, also requires a process of grieving, right, the creation story of the United States that we all grow up with in a public education system. And so I see denial. Nope, John Muir was a great guy. The things you're saying can't be true. Bargaining, but what about all the great things he did? Right? What about preserving empty, vast wildernesses, right? Anger. I'm going to go support a different organization. And then we get to sadness. This is, oh, I'm so very sad to hear about this. Woe is me. What do I do? Sometimes people get lost in this stage and will jump down the path of cultural appropriation. I will dress up like an Indian too, and then I will truly know and understand nature. Or we see the Cherokee grandmother complex play out. My great-great-great-grandma was a Cherokee Indian princess, so I don't need to think about colonialism, right? People will feel multiple stages of grief. This doesn't always happen linearly, right? But the goal, and many of the comments in this comment section on Brune's article demonstrate this 5th stage, right? The goal is to get to action, right? We've accepted, right, that the preservation movement is founded on the dispossession and removal of Indigenous peoples. And now we need to work to give land back, right? There was a great article published by Dr. Truer in the, not the Guardian, the Atlantic a couple months ago about returning all of the national parks. Here in Northwestern California, we just renamed Patrick Point State Park. Patrick Began, right, was a participant in the militias in Northern California during the Gold Rush era. It was recently renamed Sumeg State Park, which is what Yurok people have always referred to this place. My thought is that's a wonderful first step. Now we need to work on returning that land, right? And so I wanted to offer these 5 stages as a way to kind of think about the discourse we see happening in the comment section of Brune's article, Pulling Down Our Monuments. This is the start of a really important conversation, and one that requires reckoning, right, with the racist, white supremacist, and colonial history of environmental and sustainability discourse in this nation. So those are my opening remarks. I'll be quiet now and turn it over to our wonderful panelists. The first panelist we are going to hear from is Dr. Sarah Ray. So I will stop my screen share. And Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that, Kaitlin. I was just on the edge of my seat enjoying that, your description of that, and then you're bringing it up to the current moment, and even the Sumeg name change that's just so right around the corner from us, and time and space. So just some background about my interests and why maybe somebody had the idea of bringing me on to this thing, this talk about decolonizing sustainability. I'm a chair of the environmental studies program at Humboldt State, and my background, the story that I got into of how I got even interested in environmental issues in the first place is that my background is actually in more social justice orientation. And I met a colleague, and not a colleague, a professor who was my mentor, my first mentor at the University of Texas at Austin. I was doing an American Studies degree there for my master's, and I met a geographer named Diana Davis, who does post-colonial political ecology, that kind of thing. And she's the person who introduced me to thinking about the environment as a really exciting lens, or really illuminating lens that not many people were using to understand social justice better. And I thought that's something that's really exciting to me. I had been doing social justice stuff. I've been studying critical race theory, and it never had dawned on me, because I was a product of this Western thinking that the environment is something other than where human activity happens, right? Like it was codified in the Wilderness Act and the things that Kaitlin just talked about. It never had dawned on me that if you studied the environment, you could really actually understand social justice and human conditions even better. So my entry point to studying environmental studies was from the social justice lens, which I think is fairly unusual. Most of the students that come to environmental studies, and many of the colleagues I work with in the field of environmental stuff, like whether you're going to environmental, so professional associations that are about the environment, or you're trying to publish in environmental journals, the whole sort of field of environmental stuff doesn't tend to normally have this lens of social justice. And it's been sort of the agenda of my own career and my teaching and my research to push environmental studies in this direction. And the first thing that occurred to me when I was writing my dissertation was, well, why is there such a separation? Why is there such a distinction? Why is the environmental world really so at odds with social justice? In fact, there's internal conflicts. There's ways that we can't get these worlds to work together. And the history that Kaitlin Reed just kind of laid out for us gives us some insight into the US context, at least about why there's some fundamental differences. And I wanted to give a talk today about 5 myths of sustainability and social justice. So the orientation I'm coming to is, what is the tension between sustainability and social justice? Why, we simply can't have social justice and sustainability happen on this campus, in a polytechnic, in the world, wherever scale you want to talk about, unless we understand the barriers between sustainability and social justice, so that we can figure out how to address them, or maybe not. Maybe the goal is that we don't want to address them. I'm now in an environmental studies field, so I'm committed to addressing them. I'm not gonna go do something else. Although my dissertation chair, Sherry Hundorf, who's a Native American studies scholar, who's an ethnic studies professor at UC Berkeley now, she asked me, are you sure that environment is the right lens for which to work on some of these social justice issues? So it's a question that I always have lingering in my mind. So these myths that I hope they're maybe relevant to everybody of where they're coming from and what their work is, but for me, it's really a Humboldt state orientation. So do what you need to do to kind of move it, to apply it to whatever your context is. But I am going to screen share here for a second, get my slides out. Not very exciting slides, but it helps us move through this stuff. Okay, so here we go. There's my slides, and I'm present. Okay, sorry, we're on myth 5 already. How did that happen? So sorry. Oh, I want to go back to the top here. Okay. So sorry. Okay, so the myths about sustainability and social justice. The first myth is that sustainability includes social responsibility. There's an understanding with the concept of sustainability that there's these 3 legs of the stool, right? There's the economic, the ecological, and the equity leg. And people have used different words to describe those 3 legs, but there's this kind of beautiful Venn diagram image of sustainability that people get attached to when they want to advocate for sustainability. Look, we're not just doing ecology, we're not just doing capitalism, we're not just doing social justice, we're combining them all 3 in some holistic, beautiful thing. And I think that that's really idealistic, and that's very aspirational, and I really like the idea of it. Of course, it's one of the models. Sustainability is a framework where that is built into its definition, its current definition, although it's evolved over a lot of time. And some people would even call the term itself so plastic as to be meaningless, but that's a different conversation. But equity is often the one of the 3 legs that's left out, because in neo-colonial capitalism, it's easier to do the other 2 without equity. What I mean by that is that, equity is, if there's any reason that it gets in the way of the other 2, if equity ever stops the work of the ecology or the economic aspects of sustainability, it often is the one that gets the short shrift. So this leads me to my second myth, which is that being an environmentally minded person or being environmental automatically means that you have progressive social values. And I see this especially in the last few years after like in a post-Trump election, where we see these beautiful signs up that say, you know, climate change is real, Black Lives Matter, all these things, right? Love is love. So there's this sort of clumping together of progressive values that includes environmental and social justice values. And we just take that kind of for granted and don't interrogate that. In progressive ideology, since the second wave environmental movement of the 1970s, it is common to assume that the people who care about things like ecological health and biodiversity loss are the same people who care about human well-being and social justice. But they often only do so in this trickle-down sense. If we get the planet right, then social justice will follow. This view is captured in a statement that I hear from a lot of people, including many of my students sometimes, that there's no hope for social justice if we don't have a planet. This presumes this trickle-down effect, like if we just get all the carbon out of the atmosphere, climate justice will prevail. It's a seductive logic. People can make big decisions about carbon and assume that because it will help the poor, they don't need to consult the poor. This logic excludes people from the conversation. Who gets to define the problem and its solutions in the first place? It also assumes that ecological disaster is causing social injustice rather than the other way around. There are many case studies and examples that show that in fact, inequality is creating or at least exacerbating climate change. And this goes back to a lot of work of Indigenous studies scholars like Kyle Powell-White, who say actually, you know, colonialism is the thing that's causing climate change, and climate change then exacerbates the ongoing colonial experience too. So there's a mutual relationship there. Therefore, addressing inequality will trickle down to ecological well-being. That's another way of looking at it, the cause and effect. This more back and forth relationship of seeing them together as mutually constitutive, the way Kyle Powell-White does, is my own preference. A great example of this is more often than not, environmental issues and social justice issues are often in conflict with each other. This can be seen, for example, in the wind farm debate that happened locally over Terra Gen, or when politicians stoke fear over climate refugees, so they shut down borders, or when a community is excluded from an environmental process in the name of urgency. Just because the liberal ideology says that environmental issues and social justice are part of the same progressive platform, doesn't mean that the people fully understand how much these worlds have in conflict with each other. If we're to really bridge environmental sustainability and social justice, we need to spend more time understanding the nature of these conflicts and misalignments. Furthermore, people often think that greater ecological awareness comes with greater awareness of social justice issues, but this has not been historically true in the US. Few environmentally minded folks have any idea how much violence has been committed in the name of nature. It's really astonishing how little both the environmental movement and the academic fields that presumably are expert on the environment know about the fact that the science of ecology and the environmental movement in the US were built on scientific racism, white supremacist nativist fears of immigration and urbanization, all wrapped up in a heteronormative misogynist fear of a threatened masculinity, best captured by one grandfather of the conservation movement, Theodore Roosevelt. This is what I wanted to trace in my first book, The Ecological Other. Progressive era environmental views emerged out of this soup of hypermasculinity, eugenicist mothering as a national imperative, racist immigration policies, imperialist fantasies of expanding resource access in the Philippines and Cuba, and of course, continued dispossession of indigenous peoples from lands. Just as social engineering was at its peak, environmental conservation was born. This is no coincidence. And I just want to read some examples. Those examples that Dr. Reed was reading of John Muir were so great. I want to add a few more beloved people from the early days of the environmental movement. So in a part of the book, I've been discussing the history of eugenics and how that's related to early conservation. In this context of the history of eugenics, it makes sense that eugenicists' early proponents called it biological housekeeping. Ernst Haeckel, the German zoologist considered to be the founder of modern ecology, was engaged in discussions of eugenics as early as 1868, favoring death for the unfit long before eugenics gained public support. Environmental and eugenics projects reinforced each other. Earlier environmentalists wanted to dictate who belonged on America's precious soil. Examples of the overlapping interests of eugenics and conservation abound. Walt Whitman, a canonical proto-environmentalist figure, asked, what has miserable, inefficient Mexico to do with the great mission of peopling the New World with a noble race? As early as the mid to late 1800s, the prophet of environmentalism, so-called George Perkins Marsh, was drawing on social Darwinism to advance both ecological and racial ideals. Marsh exemplified how ideas about the purity of both land and bodies underwrote early environmentalism. His biographer, David Lowenthal, explains why Marsh is considered this prophet of environmentalism. He writes, at a time when the United States was moving at breakneck speed to industrialize and develop the national economy by exploiting the wealth of natural resources to the fullest, Marsh's was a lonely voice cautioning against the risk of careless growth. So Marsh was prescient in his calls for checks to industrialization. In accounts like this by Lowenthal, which reflect the accepted figure of Marsh as proto-environmentalist, Marsh's environmental alarmism hides his racism. But Lowenthal's description fails to address the fact that to Marsh, New Mexico and California were, quote, inhabited by a mixed population of habits, opinions, and characters incapable of sympathy or assimilation with our own, a race whom the experience of an entire generation has proved to be unfitted for self-government and unprepared to appreciate, sustain, or enjoy free institutions. Marsh's racial views are not included in his environmental legacy. I would argue that this absence is not a result of simply the inability of a contemporary audience to the inability of a contemporary audience to square Marsh's racial and environmental views, or even of the desire to emphasize his environmental contributions over his less savory social views. Rather, such interpretations ignore or even excuse the complementariness of environmental and racist sentiments. This link is in part a legacy of the contemporary environmental movement that still struggles to reconcile. Marsh demonstrates how concerns about environmental protection and concerns about threats to an American racial purity were inextricably linked. Roosevelt, like Haeckel and Marsh, exemplified also in how the roots of ecology were, quote, tangled up with much of the unsavory racial and eugenic theorizing of the early 20th century. The very people who founded the tradition of American natural history, ecology, and the wilderness movement, such as Emerson, Whitman, Haeckel, Marsh, Muir, and Roosevelt, were also the most strident in their concerns about racial purity. So these ideas have been talked about by political ecologists and environmental justice historians like Tracy Bryn Voiles as green hate or green colonialism, eco-fascism, and even sustainable development. There are so many ways that environmental arguments get deployed to exclude certain groups, or worse. I'm also studying this in my current research on climate anxiety, where big environmental emotions like fear and anxiety, or as in my first book, and in the things that Kaitlin Reed was quoting, disgust, environmental disgust about who belongs or trash or what counts as trash or matter in or out of place, are capable of motivating and mobilizing really great changes, but it's also just as likely to make a lot of people more racist, more nativist, and more violent, as the Christchurch and El Paso mass shootings of 2019 illustrated. Nature is never apolitical. It is not free of all these social complexities, and it often underpins some of human history's worst atrocities. So my point is that if we're really to understand the relationship between people who don't benefit from dominant power relationships and environmental sustainability, we have to understand this history. The third myth is that sustainability and TEK are the same, or traditional ecological knowledge are the same. In this myth, the story goes that because Indigenous communities had historical and sometimes even current practices that acknowledge human reciprocity with the land, that this is akin to the theory of sustainability, and therefore sustainability ticks off the box, check, yes, we've included Indigenous voices. But there are so many problems with this. First, sustainability is a very modern concept emerging in the US context from Germany's forestry approach to sustained yield in the mid-1800s. But none of the various iterations of sustainability since then have included the worldviews of any Indigenous peoples, or include any worldview that acknowledges sentience in the more than human world at all, for example. There are just huge missing parts in sustainability. And even if they were really similar, it would be appropriative to cherry pick and then repackage some Indigenous views in a modern term that comes itself originally from a German context. It may be true that sustainability at least attempts to include cultural diversity as part of biodiversity, or that it recognizes that Indigenous peoples have lived in sustainable ways for time immemorial, but that doesn't mean that sustainability is a mainstreamed version of TEK. And indeed, just as in this previous myth, sometimes one person's efforts in the name of sustainability can actually undermine Indigenous sovereignty. This is not a paradox or a one-off rare occurrence, is my point. This is actually an ongoing legacy of green colonialism. So my fourth myth is that humanity is the cause of our environmental problems. I hear this, that all of humanity being clumped into one group as evil or cancerous or anthropocentric or some other awful thing, often in my classes and all over the place. As an environmental studies person, people are often saying this to me as a way to kind of let me know that they know what I study or something. Well, nature is humanity's polar opposite. It's innocent, it's wild, it's apolitical. Karen Litfin calls this view the misanthropic temptation, because it's so tempting for white people, at least, to say, oh, humanity sucks. But this view erases all of the ways that lots of communities have historically lived in right relation with the land, and it ignores the fact that a relatively small population of humans on the planet have done something like 99% of the harm. This grievance also against humanity also makes it hard to name a culprit and thereby lets them off the hook. If I despair about the evilness of humanity, I'm less likely to hold the actual humans who are causing the harm accountable. And I'm much less likely to feel like getting up in the morning to keep getting to work on that. I'm also more likely to blame victims. The vast majority of humanity isn't doing the most harm to the planet, but the environmental movement has often historically blamed so-called overpopulating countries, migrants, and other people who don't appear to be caring about the environment enough. This implicit misanthropy of a lot of environmental awareness is really problematic, and it doesn't set us up very well to tackle our greatest environmental justice problems. Finally, the fifth myth I want to talk about is that the crises are urgent and so we must act swiftly. Who can argue with that? Greta Thunberg has said that she wants everyone to get mobilized around climate change as if their house was on fire. Meanwhile, IPCC reports warn that we have only 10 years left to make a difference at scale. Urgency is the current mode around climate change, and I appreciate why. I feel it too. But urgency makes people do stupid things. There's science to back this up. When our fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain is triggered, it suppresses our prefrontal cortex functioning, and we are likely to act in a way that feels safe in the moment, but may not align with our broader strategy. Urgency also excuses us from taking the time required to include voices that are often stampeded over in the name of speed. In situations of urgency, the loudest voice in the room, the default position, the habitual ways of thinking always win over. This is true whether I'm in a battle of wills with my kid about something or whether I'm trying to save the whales. Urgency also has the habit of making us pit our causes against each other rather than build coalitions. If time is of the essence and there's maybe only one shot at something, and maybe there's probably limited resources, then my issue goes first. It's the work of Potawatomi climate expert and environmental justice philosopher Kyle Powys-White that I think best sums this up. He asks folks to think differently about crisis epistemologies, meaning that different communities see, narrate, and respond to crises differently. For him, the crisis isn't carbon in the atmosphere, starting in the Industrial Revolution. Rather, the crisis is in the fracturing of kinship ties with community and the environment, which was an intended outcome of the colonial project. The crisis is relation then, not carbon. How might that change our definition and aims of sustainability if we prioritize relation over carbon? Can we take the time required to actually have this conversation? Or are things just too urgent to consider these approaches? What would it take to respond more wisely to what's happening rather than react out of fear? I will leave this question lingering and end there.
Oh, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. What was that phrase you used? Misanthropic. What was the second part of that phrase?
The misanthropic temptation.
Oh, I got to look into that. Cool. Thank you. If anybody in the audience has a question in response to Sarah's presentation, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will keep track of those. And if you're watching on Facebook and you have a question for Sarah, please feel free to put that in the comments and I'll keep those. Next up, we get to hear from Dr. Heather Ponchetti Daly. Heather, the floor is yours.
Hello, well, let me get this, share my screen. So
sounds good.
It's always the lovely Zoom. So my apologies if. All right. Hello. My name is Heather Ponchetti Daly. I am from the Ipe Nation of Santa Isabel, which is a Kumeyaay country, and I grew up on the Santa Isabel Indian Reservation. And currently, I am an adjunct professor at the University of California, San Diego, in the Environmental Studies Department. However, I received my PhD from UCLA with a degree in history. And I generally focused on the California Native Americans and federal Indian policies. And when I got the chance to teach in environmental studies, because I used to be a paralegal in my past life before I went to school for a very long time to get the PhD. But anyway, so once I started doing environmental law in environmental studies, I realized how much federal Indian policy is complicit in environmental law, which generally goes against Native peoples on their lands, because most of environmental law is in Indian country. And so hence, that's why I'm in environmental studies, even though I have a history degree. And currently, I am dealing with classes regarding climate change and Indigenous approaches to climate change in a global sense. So not just in the Americas, but in Africa, in the Arctic, and South America and Australia. And I'm also now trying to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into the environmental studies curriculum at UCSD. And so now let's go and talk a little bit more about, my apologies, but I do want to also thank the WIOT people and Humboldt State University for allowing me to participate in this wonderfully titled panel. And my title of this is Native Americans in Yosemite Valley and the Mythos of John Muir. And this is why. Why does UCSD have a college named for John Muir? So this is the actual statement on the website for John Muir College at UCSD. And it just says, John Muir College admitted its first students in 1967. The 19th century environmentalist, nature writer, and founder of the Sierra Club continues to inspire and inform the vision and core values of the college. John Muir was also an inventor and businessman who forged his own path and took risks. Hence, the college motto, celebrating the independent spirit, expresses our wish for all our students to lead varied, successful, committed, and self-directed lives. This particular statement at UCSD, which by the way is still on the website, as well as on pillars throughout Muir College at the university. So for me, the mythos of John Muir is very strong. And for my students, it's usually quite a shock when I present them for what John Muir stood for and his ideas about nature and Indigenous people. However, we actually, and since, thank you, Dr. Ray, because you touched on this, and also thank you, Dr. Reed, regarding what the United States is based on. And this is the epitome of what the United States, what their foundation is, and that this is the American Progress by John Gast, 1872. I have been lambasted with this particular image all through my studies. But we really do have to take a look at this and dissect it, because this image was what was largely used in Western travel guides. This image was clear about westward expansion by the Americans, and the diaphanous gowned woman holding the telegraph cable, a textbook, shows farmers with Euro-American animals and crops. And this shows that the wilderness would be conquered with agriculture, while Native Americans and wild animals, by the way, they connect there, are headed into the darkness and oblivion. And again, the myth of the vanishing Indian is born almost with just this imagery. And this is I just like to show maps. I love maps, but this is the region that the Americans wanted as a real frontier. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner, in his frontier thesis, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, stated that the West was conquered and closed. And so, and it still was a go West, young man. And we will get to, Dr. Ray actually talked a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt and his cult of masculinity. So I want to kind of click a little bit to hear who were the original stewards of Yosemite, and this was the Miwok, the Southern Sierra Miwok, and one of the tribes that lived and worked in this area called Yosemite, that would garner attention by a Scottish immigrant and eventually a president that believed that American men were becoming effeminized and needed to rediscover his manliness in the wilderness. And unfortunately for the Miwok, they came with that intention. And their their masculinity is, what's propelling them to go back to nature. And hence Yosemite became one of them. But first, how did American Indians use, manage, and conserve the lands? And when we talk about sustainability, we talk about stewardship. Native Americans were the original stewards of the land. Their modes of production included gathering, hunting, fishing, horticulture in the regions where environmental conditions varied. Natives lived with ecological limits and limited hunting. They understood the regional environments, such as controlled burning, promoting the perpetuation of plant and animal species favored in the diet. And they used only what they needed, left available through their actions, species of plants and animals, habitats, or ecosystems for others who came after them. Now, in today's culture, would they be called conservationists? But frankly, they were just being pragmatic. However, using the words of Henry David Thoreau with the Euro-American invasion, that their idea was, we can never have enough nature. We must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor, vast and titanic features, the sea coast with its wrecks, the wilderness with its living and its decaying trees, the thundercloud and the rain. In wilderness is the preservation of the world. And so here comes John Muir. So this is John Muir's bio from 1838 to 1914. He was founder of the Sierra Club. He praised the wilderness as a source of toughness and ethical values. Muir argued that many of the nation's difficulties could be attributed to too much civilization and the effete, corrupt urban values. So, it also goes to a misogyny that's deeply bred in Euro-America life. And realized that the public and politicians needed to be persuaded of the wisdom of preserving wilderness. Important allies included Gifford Pinchot, who opposed the wholesale exploitation of public lands and championed wise use, and manage of public lands for their wilderness values for forestry, grazing, hunting, and water power. So there's John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt. John Muir is the patron saint of environmentalism, an epic figure whose writings of mystical enlightenment obtained during lone treks in California's wilderness glorified individualism, and he wanted to save Yosemite from, quote unquote, the Indians, and helped establish the national park system. As the first president of the Sierra Club, Muir shaped enduring perceptions about how the wild world should be prioritized, protected, and managed. And so I say that, and here it is again. Except this one just shows that he persuaded President Roosevelt to establish Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove as federal trust lands as part of the Yosemite National Park. And this fit into Roosevelt's cult of masculinity. Men should avoid the traps of urban femininity. And emboldened by his many triumphs, his final crusade ended in failure, which I will talk about a little bit later when the Hetch Hetchy was used for San Francisco's water source. So the environmental movement, I apologize if this picture is not very clear, but when we take a look at this historically for environmental history per se, during its first 100 years, the environmental movement has been concerned almost exclusively with preserving pristine places. This is a narrow class and race-based perspective of what counts as nature, which leads the environmental movement to neglect people and the places they inhabit. And it isolates the movement from labor and civil rights concerns, and it renders it vulnerable to charges of elitism. And even by looking at John Muir's 1890 Century Magazine essays on Yosemite, it shows that there is a class and race notion when it comes to nature. And only elitists could appreciate nature. So again, Yosemite occupies a privileged place in the American imagination of the environmental movement, considering John Muir discovered his calling there, and he founded the Sierra Club and the environmental preservation movement. So for the environmentalists, Yosemite is hallowed ground. But with this comes the whitening of the wilderness. And you see the picture here showing many white women with big hats listening to John Muir. So what comes from this is that you want to keep this nature pristine. Well, what are you going to do with the natives? So John Muir and versus Native Americans. He was an advocate of views that perceive human activity as at odds with the balance of nature. He devoted his life to creating parks and wild areas that did not contain people, except for naturalists and tourists. Many of his ideas took shape when he visited and lived in California's Yosemite Valley, a place of stunning natural beauty. He saw the Miwok Indians growing crops, white settlers raising sheep, and miners seeking gold and other minerals. Muir decided then that the other occupants had to go. Although Muir claimed to oppose the oppression of Native Americans, he fully supported the extraction of Miwoks from Yosemite, referring to them as dirty, deadly, and lazy. And by the way, his was not the first description calling California Indians, California Native Americans thus. It was perpetuated first by Helen Hunt Jackson and Abbott Kinney when they wrote their 1883 report to the federal government on the conditions of California Indians. So here are some pictures of natives in the Yosemite Valley. And these pictures were taken from the Yosemite Valley website, Yosemite website, because they have a very little part where it says, oh yeah, natives used to live here. And, with the representation of their house. So when we take a look at how Yosemite Valley was constructed, really, Americans are able to cherish their national parks today only because Indians abandoned them involuntarily or were forcibly removed to reservations. Because Indian removal from Yosemite National Park occurred in the first half of the century and not in the dusty old days of Indian wars and land grabs, the park's early history presents a unique opportunity for examining the basic ideals of underpinning American conceptions of wilderness and their close links to the ideas about Native Americans. The long presence of natives in Yosemite is all the more remarkable when compared to the removal and the exclusion of Indians from other early national parks like Yellowstone. But so consequently, in an effort to hasten the vanishing of Yosemite Indians and bring the park in line with the national park system, Yosemite officials implemented the gradual Indian removal. So, and frankly, they brought in the militia to remove them. But what's even more interesting is that wilderness, does it include Indians? And in all his writings, Muir talked about Native Americans as part and parcel of the wilderness, but a part of a wilderness that needed to be removed. So, and he barely mentions them except to be racist in his descriptions. And he calls, he talks about the Natives America and where their homes are at, as the home was a home and stronghold of the Tuolumne Indians, as Ahwahnee was of the Grizzlies. So Muir's association of the Tuolumne with the Grizzlies is telling, for often in the civilization wilderness dichotomy, those not part of white civilization get coded as nature. And in his writings, My First Summer in the Sierra, which Dr. Reed talked about, Muir writes of the vague Indian instinct of walking unseen. All Indians seem to have learned this wonderful way of walking unseen, making themselves invisible like certain spiders. I have been observing here. Indians walk softly and hurt the landscape hardly more than the birds and squirrels, and their brush and oak huts last hardly longer than those of the wood rats. Again, Muir clearly associates Native Americans with nature, spiders, birds, squirrels, and wood rats. They are constructed as a natural part of the wilderness. So it's interesting enough that he thought they were part of the wilderness, but not quite. In the 20th century, park officials slowly pushed the Miwok out of Yosemite and destroyed their homes in an attempt to purify the park. In the Yosemite, Muir's account of the removal of the Yosemite's Native Americans is quite conventional, and he sees nothing wrong with the military campaign. Muir describes Native American resistance to the encroachments of miners as their usual murdering, plundering styles, and describes the Yosemite Indians as warlike tribes. And he clearly operated from the perspective that Indians are part of nature and not human agents that transform nations. He praises them for having no more impact than birds, squirrels, and wood rats. But so he just thinks they're part, that basically they gather nuts and put them away. However, he ignores the Native American practice of setting fire to the meadows, the very practice that creates the pristine Eden-like garden that he celebrates. Muir's attitude of demeaning exoticization holds sway today. We are pious toward Indian peoples, but don't take them seriously. We don't credit them with the capacity to make changes. And we don't credit them for being the actual stewards of the land that used fire to maintain nature. Just kind of want to show this Hetch Hetchy Valley. This was actually one defeat for John Muir was that he could not save the Hetch Hetchy Valley. and from the Raker Act of 1913 to construct a dam and reservoir on the Tuolumne River. And hence the O'Shaughnessy Dam was completed in 1923. He died in 1914, but he called it like this was one of the most wretched times of his life. So it wasn't just the natives that weren't keeping this area pristine. His own government basically betrayed him. And he was quoted as saying, "Damn Hetch Hetchy, as well damn for water tanks, the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has been consecrated by the heart of man." So I end this with the Sierra Club calls out racism of John Muir. This, which Muir co-founded, has acknowledged the darker part of Muir's history. He made derogatory comments about Black people and Indigenous peoples that drew on deeply harmful racist stereotypes, though his views evolved later in his life, which I kind of doubt. As the most iconic figure in Sierra Club history, Muir's words and actions carry an especially heavy weight. They continue to hurt and alienate Indigenous people and people of color who come into contact with the Sierra Club. This was posted on this website, and this was from an LA Times article from 2020. That review found that Muir held bigoted views toward Indians. He used such negative terms as dirty, garrulous as jays, superstitious, deadly, lazy, squirrelish, and wife-stealing to describe California Indians. Yet, even after the Sierra Club acknowledged the racism of John Muir, individuals that belonged to the Sierra Club canceled their memberships and used the terms "that's ancient history," "time for the Indians to get over it," and "how dare you attack our hero, he is a saint." So this is generally my one of my lectures that I give to my students in my environmental law and federal Indian policies class, because this is an Indian environmental studies class, and they really, and most of them are enrolled in Muir College. So I always like to present them that this is the John Muir and this is the school that you're in, but you need to know the real history. Thank you.
Oh, that was so wonderful, Heather. Thank you very much. I loved both of your presentations. There's a really apt comment on Facebook that I think really transitions well from your last slide. Dr. Jared Aldern wrote on Facebook, "Those Sierra Club commenters who defend John Muir are missing the point. Legislated wilderness is an injustice right now. It's not an arcane issue to argue over Muir's historical context. It's contemporary, right? This is a contemporary problem the US should solve by restoring native land tenure." So if you haven't, if folks haven't checked out the panel we held on fire and food sovereignty with Dr. Dahl, I recommend you all go check that out. I just thought it was a really appropriate way to respond to your last slide, Dr. Daly. I loved both of your presentations. Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about myth 3, that sustainability and TDK are not the same. And your discussions of green colonialism, I think, are really, really important to be having at this present moment in the way you connect that to the TerraGen wind projects. Dr. Daly, I love that you open your presentation with the John Muir College. You really had me laughing when you called John Muir the patron saint of environmentalism, and like thinking of missionization in Southern California and the way it's impacted more people. I was wondering, oh, before I have a bunch of questions. Before I dive into those, if anyone in the audience has a comment or a question for our panelists today, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible, but a lot of you are very curious and interested. So if we don't get to your question, my apologies. Yeah, Heather?
Yeah, well, somebody wrote, "What is the source of the wilderness, the American West map?" And that's from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA.
Wow. Oh, that's disheartening.
I know.
So if folks could put their questions into the chat, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. the first question I wanted to pose for you, Dr. Daly, is that we're kind of in this moment of renaming. And so recently in our neck of the woods, Patrick's Point State Park just recently was renamed Sumeg State Park. That happened a few weeks ago. I was wondering if there have been any conversations at your institution, UCSD, about renaming the college and what those conversations have been like on your campus.
There have been conversations. Our provost, Dr. Wayne Yang, he's very cognizant of what John Muir represents. However, these are difficult conversations, as we saw from that article last year, how I'm going to burn my Sierra Club membership card. And, and then when you're dealing with trustees of universities, and specifically who maybe graduated from Muir College, that this is their history, and how dare these new line liberals or whatever, that people are, how come you're wanting to change something that has been in place only not even, maybe a little over 50 years, but it's sacred to them. I guess that's a kind of a word that I need to say, because it is that John Muir is sacred to them, like a patron saint. And so it's going to be a long haul. I hate to say that, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. I wish it were.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that update with us. And if there's any partnerships we can make between HSU, NAS, and your university, I'm all for it. The next question I'd like to pose to both of our panelists today comes from Nancy. Nancy is interested in how a lot of the concepts and arguments we're making in today's session applies to urban contexts. How do we take this kind of foundation of the environmental movement that's rooted in white supremacy and settler colonialism, and what does that mean for urban spheres? She's particularly interested in what does this mean for sustainable housing development, as we have a lot of people that lack access to housing. And so what does this conversation we're having mean for urban contexts?
I'd love to jump in and just say one thing, which is that one of the ways that these myths play out in an urban context is to assume that there is no nature in cities, and that stems to that root of those progressive era worries about the feminization of cities and getting out into wilderness to do, masculine, reinforce your masculinity, that there's that created this binary notion that there's no nature in cities. And I often find this in things like Richard Liu's argument, and in the field of education, it's been huge. His work on the nature deficit disorder has been really formative in environmental education. And there's built into a lot of that environmental ed mythology, although there's a lot of pushback in that field too, which I really want to honor and appreciate, that there's somehow, there's an unquestioned assumption that nature does this stuff to us, and we all should know what that looks like, and it's not available underneath a freeway, And so that this sort of assumptions about where nature is, which nature counts, that can do this work on people, that's so generative. And of course, from the frontier stuff that you were talking about, Professor Daly, the loss of the frontier was not just a loss of resources or nature, it was a loss of the potential for where we were going to build all of these democrats. I mean, this was really the founding fathers' notion of what creates the American democratic citizen was this frontier stuff, so it was deeply entrenched. It was way back with Washington, it was way back with Jefferson and de Tocqueville and stuff. And so, that manifests in this anti-urbanism stuff. And I noticed that at the HSU context, that there's this sort of dismissive, racially coded language around students who come from the cities and come out to Humboldt State to get away from the city. And it's just assumed as a positive narrative that this is very enlightened of them, that they want to come out to all this nature because they must know that that's where all the good life happens, And I think that this is really damaging. So there's a real anti-urban strain in environmentalism that is really unchecked, and it hasn't been challenged enough in enough spaces. And I would say the more we can bring questions, and one of the reasons why I like sustainability actually as a framework is because it can be applied to urban settings without having to combat all of these assumptions about where nature is. It is a approach that really not easily, I was going to say naturally, but I would catch myself, it easily seems to conjure up for people possible applications in urban settings. And so sustainability in some ways transcends some of the work, those problems in some ways that the idea of nature and environmental wilderness have in the American mind,
Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Dr. Daly?
Well, I specifically deal a lot with environmental racism. And that happens obviously, we were talking about it happens in the wilderness, what is nature, but it truly does happen in urban settings the most, specifically in areas where people don't have the resources that they are able to fight, quote unquote, big business. And I also deal with the contamination of water. That's what I've been studying lately regarding how on Indian reservations, a lot of the potable water has been contaminated by uranium mines. However, that deals with the urban construct as well, because this water eventually goes to the cities. And so we do need to, as Dr. Ray said, we really, really do need to have more conversations regarding water, land, and nature issues for the urbanity. That's pretty much all that I have, because I do deal with mainly native Indian reservations that were purposely put outside the urban construct.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just add one thing that your question got me thinking about, Nancy. Many native peoples live in urban contexts due to like relocation and urbanization policies from the mid 20th century. You've got me thinking specifically about the West Berkeley Shell Mound, which for folks from the Bay is located at 4th and Hearst, currently covered in concrete. And right now they want to build affordable housing complexes on top of the Shell Mound. For me, this really connects to what Dr. Ray was talking about green colonialism. We can't use environmentalism or sustainability as a justification for the continued desecration of native cultural resources, right? Especially when they are in these urban contexts due to processes of colonialism. I know we are nearing the end of our time. We'll spin the wheel and give away Dr. Ray's book in 1 minute. I just have one question for you both, that we have a lot of students in the audience. We also have a lot of folks that are working with or in some way connected to environmental organizations or agencies. Many of the students I see in the audience are just starting out their natural resource sciences or environmental studies careers or majors. For folks entering out into the environmental justice world, are there any pieces of advice you would like to share with the young people here on anything they should think about as they navigate the rest of their major or enter their career?
I myself know the laws, know environmental law, know Native American resource law, know what is precedent out there, know what the Supreme Court rules regarding environmental issues. I know many of you may be just science. I'm not going to ever take a look at that, but this is the foundation of what environmentalism is. And I mean, especially environmental justice. You have to know the law. And I'm a big environmental law person. So that for me, just know a little bit. Just know what the rules are out there and how you can get environmental justice for areas that have been affected and for people.
Yeah, I always tell Indigenous students and other folks, like, tribes need to know settler state laws better than the settler state.
Exactly.
Great. Is there anything you'd like to add in closing, Sarah?
Sure, I can't resist that question. It's such a great question, Kaitlin. So thanks for asking it. And along those lines, I'd say the advice for students who are pursuing environmental fields is that the ways that the colonial capitalist institution of higher education has siloed out these forms of knowledge production are not true, real, objective, right, correct, ethical, whatever the word is. So the best you can do is get a wide range of disciplines to talk about environmental issues. That's why environmental studies is about interdisciplinarity. But even better, you go outside of the institution and you also think of your own traditions of wisdom and environmental knowledge in your own family and your own history. So knowledge about environmental issues is coming from lots and lots of places. And don't just assume that the way the institution is setting it up is correct. In fact, it actually does a lot of damage.
Excellent. Thank you. I think those are really powerful words to end on. Next up is the moment you have all been waiting for. Let me screen share and we will spin the wheel as a reminder. Yeah, isn't it cool? I can even full screen it. So folks, we will be giving away a copy of Dr. Sarah Ray's first book, The Ecological Other. If I can find the subtitle here in my notes, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture. And let's go ahead and spin the wheel. Congratulations, Meredith. Let me make sure Meredith is present.
Lucky Meredith.
Excellent. Meredith is here. That is wonderful to hear. Meredith, if you could send us a private message with your email address, we will be in touch. Well, you won today. Wonderful. We will be in touch shortly with where we can send your book. Okay, I am not screen sharing. Good. Thank you all for coming. I just want to say that this recording will be available on our HSU Facebook page or HSU NAS Facebook page immediately after. We will post it to our YouTube channel soon. I hope to see all of you next Wednesday for our third session, which is titled Colonialism is Not Over, Green Colonialism and Sustainability from the 30-meter telescope to the TerraGen wind projects, featuring PhD candidate Melinda Adams and Dr. Kasumbo Salazar. We're very excited for that panel. We hope to see you all next Wednesday and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Good to meet you, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Our pleasure. You guys were both wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh, yep. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Okay, I'll stop live streaming to Facebook now.